Welcome to part 6 of Presidents, Plutocrats, Paupers, and Populists. Now we're going to take a look at the Second Industrial Revolution. Like many other nations in Europe in the first half of the 19th century, the United States began going through an industrial revolution. We often refer to it as the First Industrial Revolution between the 1800s and the 1850s and stuff like that, right? It was rather small, though, compared to other European powers, mostly because there was this whole issue of slavery that was kind of dragging the entire nation down as far as advancement goes. That debate over whether this should be a slave nation or a free nation. Well, the Civil War, of course, is going to put that to rest, right? And so in the post-Civil War era, you're going to see the United States go through an industrial explosion. I'll give you some examples. In 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, there were only 3 million industrial workers in the entirety of the United States. By 1900, there was 13.5 million industrial workers. 20% of the American population worked in industry. In 1860, the United States was outproduced by any of the major European powers. By 1900, the United States was producing more industrial goods than the entirety of all of Europe combined, including Russia. Okay. Of course, technology was at the forefront of all this. You had coal-fired plants coming into prominence, steam engines, the beginning of electrification. All of this amplified the industrialization of the United States, and as well as the continued industrialization of Europe, right? This was also pioneered by the creation of the modern corporation, right? This was first started with the railroads, whereas prior to the Second Industrial Revolution, you typically had companies, right? Companies that were owned by individuals. Now you're going to start having businesses that require larger infusions of cash than an individual can do. So you create the corporation, which is a small group of investors. You sell stock in the company, right, to raise revenue. So people own portions of this. You have layers of managers, right? When you have a problem with Microsoft, you don't just sit there and say, well, I'll just write Bill Gates a letter and he'll get back to me, right? You have a customer support line, right? You have that kind of layer system going in place. That's what corporations do, right? You have the birth of the corporate executive officer, someone who doesn't necessarily have a majority stake in the business, but is hired to manage the corporation. We'll talk about one. His name's Jim Frick, right? We'll talk about him a little bit later. Okay, and then of course you also have the in this Second Industrial Revolution, you have the creation of monopolies. Now, when we look at monopolies, there's 3 different types of monopolies, right? And so I'll go over each one in turn and kind of give you an example so that you know what it looks like, right? For example, a horizontal integration. A horizontal monopoly is a monopoly where you've eliminated any competition for a specific product, right? Where you dominate a single industry. A good example of that would be John D. Rockefeller, right? John D. Rockefeller is going to, at the peak in his oil refining industry, he is going to control 90% of the American oil supply and 70% of the global oil supply, right? That's a horizontal monopoly. He controls the oil industry, and that's what a horizontal monopoly would look like, right? The next type of monopoly to take a look at is a vertical monopoly. And this is where you control every step of a process, right? Andrew Carnegie was notorious for having vertical monopolies. Andrew Carnegie in his steel industry, he didn't own just the steel plants, right? He owned the mines that extracted the coal and coke and the iron ore, and he owned the the smelters that refined them into raw iron. He owned the railroads and the steamships that transported them, and he owned the final storefronts, if you will, that sold it. So that's a vertical monopoly is where you own every step of the process, from its raw material to the finished good. That's what a vertical monopoly looks like, right? So horizontal, you control one industry, right? Vertical is when you control all the processes of an industry, and then the third one is a geographical. This was typically done by the railroads. One of the most important aspects of the Second Industrial Revolution is the ability to move products to markets, right? move it from the production facilities to markets. Railroads could therefore dominate regions. If you own, I'll just use Georgia for example. If you own all the railroads in Georgia, that means that you can have influence on all the, you don't even have to own them. You can have influence on all the industries in Georgia, right? Because you're setting the freight rates for them to transport their goods to market. So if one of these industries, one of these company owners or whatever makes you mad, what you do is you can just jack up his freight rates to the point that he cannot afford to get his products to market. You drive him out of business, and maybe you purchase his business, or maybe you have one of a company that you're friendly with purchase his business. That's a geographical monopoly. And like I said, we see during the Industrial Revolution, we see all three of these types of monopolies being created. So what kind of people were creating these industrial empires, right? What kind of people were going to become labeled either robber baron or captains of industry, which I'll talk about in the next section, right? Well, it's people like this guy, Cornelius Vanderbilt. I'm going to just kind of introduce you to these industrialists by using him. He's one of the early of these industrial pioneers in the Second Industrial Revolution, right? He was the son of a ferryman and a farmer, and by the age of 16, he was transporting people around New York Harbor. Okay. During the War of 1812, he had gotten a government contract to supply military units in the New York area, including up the Hudson River to West Point. Right. In 1818, he sold all his interest to go work with a man named Thomas Gibbons, who owned a steamship line. He got into steamships at this point. He saved up enough by 1829 to start his own steamship line, and again would begin to dominate all Hudson River traffic in New York until the California Gold Rush. California Gold Rush, he actually did something pretty interesting. He sold off all his interests and he started a new steamship line that went from New Orleans to Panama, and then a separate steamship that went from Panama to San Francisco. What was he doing? Well, you would go down to New Orleans, you would get on his steamship, he would take you to Panama. There's no Panama Canal yet, but you were put on a stagecoach then that went across the very narrow isthmus of Panama, put you on another steamship, and would take you up to San Francisco to get to the gold rush. How successful was this? Well, let me put it this way. The stagecoach companies, which were taking people across the continental United States, banded together and paid Cornelius Vanderbilt $50,000 per month in 1850 money, $50,000 per month to not run his business. Now think about that for a minute. That is that's like over $1 million a month today. But just think about that for a minute. I'll tell you right now, if somebody made me an offer right now, I'm going to pay you $50,000 a month in today's money, in 2020 money, to do nothing, I'm going to do a hell of a lot of nothing. Man, you won't even be able to tell if I'm alive. I'll be doing so much nothing at $50,000 a month in today's money. This guy's getting paid $50,000 a month in 1850s money. Okay, so he does that, right? After the gold rush simmered down, he got involved with railroads, specifically again in New York. He's going to purchase up almost every railroad in New York. And he's even going to build the original Grand Central Terminal. It's not the one that's there now. It's since been rebuilt. But the first Grand Central Terminal in New York City, he will have built this, right? Now, often, again, when we talk about what kind of people these were, often when we look at Cornelius Vanderbilt, he's not known for his philanthropy, right? And here's the reason why. It's what happened after he died, right? Upon his death, he was worth about $100 million, okay? He accumulated a vast amount of wealth. But in his will, he didn't distribute very much of it, right? He left $50 to his church. All right, he's worth $100 million. In his will, he left $50 for his church. Here, get yourself something nice. He left $800,000 to to New York University, and he left $1 million to the University of Tennessee at Nashville under the condition that they changed their name. And they still go by that name today, Vanderbilt University, right? But the rest of that $100 million fortune went to his son, William, right? So at the time of his death, the Vanderbilt family had wealth that exceeded that of the royal family in England and even had more estates than these guys did, right? So these men that become these industrialists, these captains of industries or robber barons, are going to collect vast amounts of wealth.